Hello, I'm Juliet Mann, and this is the Agenda podcast, CGTN Europe's one-stop shop for smart, in-depth discussion of the issues that really matter in the world today. 2023 has so far been something of a bumpy ride for the global economy. Inflation remains stubbornly high, banks have collapsed, and debt is spiralling upwards for some of the world's largest economies. There's been some better news, with China growing and opening up for business post-pandemic, and fears of a global recession seeming to melt away. So where exactly do things stand now? What can we expect for the rest of the year? Well, with me now is the former president of the European Central Bank, Jean-Claude Trichet. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the agenda, sir. Look, I wonder, what do you see as the role of central bankers in these tough economic times? And do you think it's a role that's maybe changing to maybe expect crisis rather than just manage it?
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to respond to your questions. And of course, the situation is very, very demanding, obviously, at a global level and at the continental level. To respond to your question, I would say that central banks, of course, have to continue to ensure price stability. It is their main mandate, if I may, at the global level, and I take it that it is even more important at the moment I'm speaking than it was the case before, because we really have real threats coming from the inflation side. So ensure price stability, ensure financial stability, which is also extremely important, and particularly systemic financial stability, which has been recognized as one of the major responsibilities of central banks since the Lehman Brothers crisis. And of course, the central banks, at the moment I'm speaking, have a number of instruments, of tools, that they did not necessarily had before, but exist today, and make them pretty well armed, if I may, to cope with all the difficulties that might come. I also have to mention that to do their job correctly, central banks have to be independent, in my view, as well from the executive branches, or for the market itself and the private sector itself. It's very, very important that they are really trying to deliver what they were created for in a medium long-term perspective. That would be my summing up, if I may, of what we can expect from central banks at the moment.
And we'll dig into that a little bit more in a moment. But I want to talk to you about your intimate knowledge of the European banking system. So I want to know what you think is really going on in the sector right now. I mean, you know, we've had the fallout of the collapse of SVB, and in the US, we've got the crumbling of Credit Suisse in Switzerland. I mean, do you think we're going to be seeing more banks crumble this year?
Well, I hope not. And in the case of the regional banks in the United States, clearly there was unfortunately a reason for these difficulties, because the part of the so-called recommendation of the Basel rules and regulations, including the net stable funding indicator, was not respected for the small banks. The big banks in the US respected that standard and that regulation, but not the regional banks. And of course, they were very, very hardly, dramatically, if I may, touched by this element. Of course, there was a strong response immediately of the authorities, and we have to recognize that the authorities were up to their own responsibility. So the problem is not to be dramatically aggravated. I take it that we might be reassured that this will be solved. In the case of Credit Suisse, we are in a totally different universe, because it was a big bank, but the weakest of the big banks all over the world. And not surprisingly, when you had problems in part of the banking system, namely in the US with the regional banks, I would say, market was very, very keen on checking what was happening with Credit Suisse, because, again, it was the weakest. And on top of that, you have a number of remarks which were made by stockholders of the Credit Suisse, which created the difficulty. That being said, I must say myself, I was expecting more difficulties coming from the, I would say, sphere of non-banks, the financial sphere of the non-banks, because it seems to me that it is in this area that we might have more highly leveraged institutions, more highly leveraged segment of markets, more necessity to refinance. And then I would not be surprised if you have some difficulties emerging out of the very vast sphere of the non-banks. So I'm not expecting, I have to say, it's a personal view, of course, too much problems coming from the banks themselves after what we have observed, and certainly not in Europe, in my opinion, in the European Union. Still, of course, we are living in a financial world which remains fragile in some respect, and we have to be very vigilant, very, very careful, and full of attention to what might come from, again, as I said, financial sphere in general, but more particularly the non-banks.
You talk about the financial sphere being fragile. So I'd like you to look back at your time at the European Central Bank and what happened in 2008. How is what you see happening now different to what happened in the last big financial crisis?
Yes, certainly. What's happening now is very different in many respects, but there are also similarities. The differences, first, we were in a world where prudentials had been very, very neglected. So in the banking sphere in general, you had a vulnerability of the banks, commercial banks, investment banks, which was really considerable. And not surprisingly, it was the banking system that was very, very heavily touched when the crisis erupted. A lot of lessons have been drawn from that period, and the rules, regulation, the Basel's rules have been considerably improved since then, with, I would say, a multiple of the capital requirements that were required before Lehman Brothers that are now required. So major difference from that standpoint. Another difference is the benign neglect of the private sector, but also of the public sector at the time. This idea that we were in the best of the world possible, that there was no real risk to cope with in the future, which was more or less the situation immediately before the major difficulty that we had observed, of course, with the subprime crisis and the Lehman Brothers crisis. All this does not exist today. Of course, everybody knows today that difficulty might come, that you have to be very prudent and cautious, that vigilance is of the essence. That makes also a very big difference. Similarities, I would say the major similarity I see is the overall leverage of the global economy. When I look at the, I would say, consolidated public and private debt, outstanding public and private debt at the global level, I see a level of indebtedness that is very, very important, and even at a global level, more important than what we had in, say, to simplify, 2007, 2008. The substitution, a very important substitution of emerging countries and developing countries' outstanding debt to the developing countries, advanced economies debt has been operated during that period, so that the main culprit, if I may, for this very high level of outstanding global debt is more the emerging countries, and the developing countries. But all that being said, the world at the present moment, in my opinion, all taken into account, remains in a fragile situation, and that is a similarity with what we had observed in the time of the subprime and Lehman Brothers collapse.
I appreciate that you're saying we need to keep an eye on emerging and developing economies when it comes to debt, but there are predictions that the United States could default on its national debt in just the next few months. And there's a political standoff with virtually no negotiation happening on how to resolve that. I mean, what do you think that says to the rest of the world? What's your take on that?
Well, I have been in the business, if I may, for many, many years. So I have experienced several episodes looking very much like the present episode, some kind of major difficulty between the executive branch and the Congress and the House of Representatives in particular, and this idea that after all, if there is no agreement, then you have the possibility for the United States not to honor their debt. All times, without any exception, when we were in such a situation, of course, a solution was found out, because whatever the difficulty are, there is always a way to avoid that. Would be a total catastrophe, of course, which would be the default of the US Treasury. So I don't think at all that it would be the end result of the present major difficulty. It seems to me that it's extremely unlikely that they didn't find a solution, but that does not suggest, of course, that you do not have major problems, major political difficulty, fierce, I would say, quarrel between the Republican executive branch and the Democrat House of Representatives. So again, you see, I'm tranquille as far as the end result is concerned. I expect still a lot of fierce battles, if I may, to be observed.
Let's talk about consumers, because it does feel like the response of central banks to the financial instability is to raise interest rates. And I wonder if you think we're entering into a prolonged era or period of higher interest rates, and what that will mean ultimately for consumers.
Well, first of all, of course, we have obviously a problem in major economies of the world, and certainly in practically all advanced economy, a major problem of inflation. And in the long run, if you don't combat inflation, then you have interest rates that are going up and up and up and up and up, because the savers and investors considers that they have to, I would say, hedge themselves against future inflation. So the interest rates, the market interest rates, not the interest rates that are decided upon by the central banks, but the interest rates that are decided by the market are going up and up and up and up. And so, in my opinion, it is pretty wise by the central bankers to try to combat inflation. By the way, they are encouraged by the international institutions to not to practice benign neglect in this respect. So, again, it is normal in a period where you have inflation at levels that are, frankly speaking, pretty high in comparison with the objective of many, many central banks, which is around 2%, when you have headline inflation at the level of 7% or at the level of 5% in the US, 5% in the euro area, 7%. It means, of course, a lot in terms of, I would say, dangers if it goes on. And of course, if it accelerates, it could be as dramatic as it was in the previous very high inflation period that the global economy observed. Unfortunately, after the first oil shock until the second oil shock in 73 up to the start of the 80s. And then, of course, we had inflation galloping up to 14%. So you see, much, much higher than what I was mentioning. The interest rates had to go even higher, much higher, at 20%, to be compared to what we are observing now, which is, of course, much, 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 much lower. So we have to understand the lessons of the past. I think that it is important that the central banks, and not only the central banks, I would say all partners are at stake there, not only the authorities, but also the private sector, in order to regain control of inflation, which again is mainly to avoid drama in the future. That, of course, it is not easy to operate. It is not easy to be courageous enough to take the decisions that are not necessarily, I would say, very pleasant, but it is necessary. And in my understanding, for the poorest, for the most vulnerable part of the population of any society, it's very important that you maintain price stability and combat inflation, because inflation is particularly difficult to, I would say, cope with for the most vulnerable and the poorest part of our population. The wealthy part of the population have many ways of guaranteeing, protecting themselves against inflation, which is not the case of the poorest.
Let's talk about global growth and where that's coming from. How important is China, do you think, to a robust economic recovery?
Well, China was, in comparison with its previous years of growth, of very rapid and impressive growth, China was very touched by the COVID, of course. And last year, I understand the growth, the estimated growth for 22 were 3%. 3%, much lower, of course, than what China normally observes. So the end of COVID, and the change of the policy in China, which certainly was very welcome, but the change of the attitude of vis-à-vis confinement and so forth, is putting the growth in China at a much higher level. So that's good. And in 23, the best estimate are more than 5%. So in comparison with 3% in 22, more than 5% in 23, in 23rd is something which is very, very, I would say, important. That does not mean necessarily that China will continue to grow in the future as in the past, for many reasons. We can go under all those reasons, but it was observed in all countries in the world. I mean, you had a period of catch-up, which is always very, very impressive. And then when the catching up process is already established, there is some kind of logistic, I would say, curve for the real growth. And we will see exactly what happens. But what I note, of course, is that this year, the contribution of China to growth, growth in China first, and global growth is quite substantial.
And what impact do you think things like the US Inflation Reduction Act and President Biden's upcoming plans to limit US investment in China are having on the global economy? Many have called it simple protectionism. Would you agree?
Well, it's a very complex situation, because I observe everywhere in the world because of the previous crisis, because also of the COVID crisis, because of all the risks that could materialize, an attitude vis-à-vis the long, if I may, important global value chain that we were used to in the period of very active globalization, the period of accelerating globalization. And now we are in a different universe. Clearly, I see that in the US, of course, you just mentioned it. I see that in Europe, obviously, with this idea that we had not all the medicine that we should have in the time of the COVID, that we have to protect ourselves against the possible breakdown of, as I said, this long value, global value chain for production of many goods and services. And I see that also in China, by the way. China also wants to be less depending on the outside world in some respect. So I take it that after a very, very important period of accelerating globalization, we are now probably, for many reasons, in a period where the hedging against the breakdown of part of this global value chain becomes something important. And I would say that without any mentioning at this stage of, I would say, geostrategic issues, but only to be sure that we can produce in time what is necessary for our various societies. So let's be prepared, in my opinion, for a period of slow globalization. I would not say necessarily deglobalization, because I take it that the division of labor at a global level remains of I would say, decisive importance, that we can have at a global level and at the level of each particular economy or continent a lot of benefits coming from this division of labor at a global level, but it is much more a period of slow globalization with the hedging against all the possible difficulty that could occur in the global value chain. Of course, this is my perception today at the moment I'm speaking. We will see what happens. And I had mentioned the global geostrategic risks. If there is materialization, further materialization of these strategic risks, then I expect that we could see more of the deglobalization, which I hope we will not have.
Well, speaking of the risks and the difficulties, the current head of the European Central Bank, Christine Lagarde, said recently that the fragmentation of the world economy into rival blocs led by the United States and China threatens to destabilize global commerce and increase inflation, weaken growth. Do you see that happening?
Well, I think that, of course, the rival blocs which were mentioned are, of course, major risks, as said Christine Lagarde, for global commerce and for growth. I would say many for growth. I hope very much that as the I would say Europeans very often are saying that we will have something like a de-risking period. It was more or less what I was saying, namely, let's try to diminish risks that are associated with the overall, I would say, global value chain and overall division of labor at a global level. But let's not decouple. De-risking, it is the words of von der Leyen, the president of the Commission, and I take it that it is important. De-risking, but not decoupling. And that was more or less what Christine was warning against the decoupling, real fragmentation of the global economy. That would be really very bad, in my opinion. And I fully join, of course, von der Leyen and Christine Lagarde on this diagnosis. Let's try to diminish the possible materialization of risks, but let's not embark in a decoupling that would be, in my opinion, unthinkable. But if the planet, which is our, I would say, a global spaceship, is divided in 2 or 3, it would be totally dramatic, with no communication between the various part and parcel of the single spaceship, which is the planet. And we all agree that there is a single spaceship, and we try to do all what we can to protect it against possible major difficulty with the environment side, with the global warming, climate change, and so forth. So if we recognize that we are in a single spaceship, we have to recognize that we have to cooperate, all of us, again, with the appropriate de-risking of the various countries concerned, but certainly not the decoupling, which would be a catastrophe.
Jean-Claude Trichet, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this edition of the Agenda podcast. Do join me next week when I'll be in Geneva to speak to the Managing Director of the World Economic Forum, Saadia Zahidi, at WEF's Growth Summit 2023. Remember, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find more agenda content on CGTN Europe's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Telegram, and YouTube channels. Until next time, goodbye.
The most interesting questions.
Are there other living beings beyond Earth?
Will man or machine be in charge?
Great question.
Always have more than one answer.
Well, hold on, let me just draw up a list.
And always come from more than one person.
That's where the credibility lies.
The concept of having a machinery which is alive and evolving didn't wait for us.
The end of inequality of incomes and wealth around the world, can you imagine how difficult that is at the moment to achieve?
Every episode, Stephen Cole, Murray Beveridge, and some of the brightest minds out there shed light on the answers to some of the most intriguing questions.
There are 2 ways of looking at this.
Machines can't really discriminate between civilian and military targets.
The Answers Project.
Maybe we need to just look at this in a bit more detail.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
The Answers Project, a new podcast from CGTN Europe.